What's your theory
Uh,
as to why your wife is resistant to atheism or philosophy,
Um,
I guess?
well, she has experiences in her past that she interprets as absolute proof that there is a spiritual world populated by devils and demons and God and everything.
You mean she's experienced, she feels she's experienced direct supernatural?
She feels that she's experienced miracles. She was also raised in as you may have read but forgot, a very abusive upbringing. Uh, Her father didn't calm down until he actually had a stroke and was brain dead for like 12 minutes before he came back, and he lost most of his personality as well as his memories of everything, and he was like a 12-year-old until the day he died. And so he ended up being taken care of by his ex-wife because he was completely, you know, just he was dependent again. Um, but he would be violent and everything. But I think one of the things is her brother had a bad car accident, and all of his intestines were like turned around and everything, and they were going to go and do an operation, but the chart had been smudged mysteriously, and so they had to go and take new X-rays, and apparently everything had corrected itself internally. And she says that was because her church prayed for him.
Wow.
And
And of
so,
course, I'm sure this is completely obvious, and I don't think this is the source of your, I mean, what do I know? This is just my theory. I don't think this is the source of your wife's faith. Because, of course, if God can come down and start flicking intestines around, then why didn't he nudge the car over so the car accident didn't happen to begin with?
well, that's true. And then we've had the whole free will debate, and I said, well, he's going to send you to hell if that's like putting a gun to your head. How much free will is that? I said, well, God lives by different rules. Those are different
Right.
rules.
So how do we know that God is good if God lives by different
Right.
rules, right? I mean, and of course, how can God send people to hell if he already knows ahead of time, since he's all knowing, that they're going to do what they're going to do?
Yeah.
And how
Oh,
can God
I've
send people to hell for crimes when, for the vast majority of cases, it would appear that those crimes arise out of evil that was done to them as children, which they're clearly not morally responsible for? Somebody who's brought up in a loving, happy household is very unlikely to become a criminal or a drug addict, whereas somebody brought up in an abusive household, the odds are multiple times higher that they're going to end up with this kind of dysfunction. Clearly, it's not the fault of the child for being abused, so how can God have the same moral standards for somebody raised peacefully versus someone raised violently? And how can he send a kid to hell who's had so little chance in life to get ahead? How can he send some Somali 19-year-old who's never heard of Jesus to hell for not knowing about Jesus? Obviously the moral problems with omniscience and omnipotence are so enormous that unless your wife has achieved the intellectual capacity of her own father after his stroke, then it's clearly not a rational or moral position that's where she's coming from. That would be my argument,
well,
because
she's
she's married you, she's an intelligent woman, and so it can't be a lack of understanding that is the barrier.
yeah. Well, I mean, she it is irrational because I mean she's on one hand she told me twice, oh, you're going to hell because you're atheism, but on the other hand, when the arguments come up later, well, she doesn't really believe that there is a hell per se, which is why I said earlier in this conversation, by her own definition, she's a heretic.
Well,
Uh,
listen, I will tell you what I think, which obviously has no particular truth value. These are all just theories and impressions, so you can take it with a grain of salt as much as you like. But this comes out of a couple of decades of hard-won, hopefully some sort of wisdom about debating ideas with people. It's not what it's about. When you debate with philosophy with people, it's almost never, ever, ever about what you think it's about. It's not about rational proofs. It's not about logical consistency. It's not about empirical evidence. It's not about a clear path to truth. It's not about a value for truth. People will say that it is about that, but it's really not. And,
no,
and
it's
that is,
childhood.
well, it is about childhood, of course, but as an adult, it's not quite the same. If you want to figure out why somebody is resisting clear and obvious rationality, then the first place that you need to look at is what is the impact of accepting a basic philosophical truth, What is the impact of that acceptance on her personal relationships in the present? Right? People will judge an idea by its effect on their personal relationships, but they will never say that. They will pretend that it's about some rational argument or some experience or the intestines were shifted around and like, but that's not what it's about. What it's about is, okay, what happens to my personal relationships if I accept that statism is force, if I accept that taxation is violence, if I accept that there's no such thing as deities? What is going to happen to my personal relationships? That's what you need to look at. Most people's arguments for whatever truth is being proposed or denied are ex post facto justifications for maintaining the status quo in their existing relationships. This has evolutionary advantages, of course, in that we needed other people in the past, in particular, to get food, raise kids. I think it's more so true for women than it is for men biologically. And again, this is all just theory, but particularly, of course, in the past, women were more dependent upon relationships than men because women were constantly pregnant. So they needed people to bring them food. They needed people to help raise their kids. They needed people to build them shelter and so on because they were busy having babies and raising children. So women are particularly more, I think, geared towards being the peacemakers in their social relationships. And this results, of course, often in, this is quite frustrating for men, in an endless trivialization of life. Because any deep or resonant or powerful issues are going to raise conflict, and women, whether by nature or by socialization or by both, seem to be very strongly disposed to minimizing conflicts among family members. And that means a relentless trivialization of topics, that you can talk about the weather, that you can talk about sports, you can talk maybe even a little bit about politics, but the moment anybody brings up anything that is contentious, women, like an expertly tuned fire engine, will firefighting crew will arise and douse any potential flames of conflict, because to minimize conflict seems to be the role of women. And again, you can see some evolutionary advantages to this, and there seems to be a lot of socialization for things that way. And so when you bring up again, this is all gross generalizations, and I apologize to all the brilliant philosophical women out there and all of the peacemaking, trivializing men. But you bring up a topic in particular with a woman, and she does not listen to the reason, she does not listen to the evidence. It drops down into her heart, radiates out across her social relationships, and say, will this be positive or negative for my social relationships? Will this engender conflict, or will this make it easier for me to get along with people in my life? Now, philosophy, unfortunately, does not usually make it easier to get along with people in your life, at least until the world becomes more philosophical. That is how it's going to be. But women are intensely attuned to conflict avoidance. Philosophy brings significant conflict into relationships, and therefore women will work to minimize, block, and defuse any potential philosophical conversations in their environment. It's one of the great barriers to the spread of philosophy. I'm not blaming women for this. This is, and again, this is just a theory. I'm not, tons of exceptions and all the caveats in the world. But if you want to understand why your wife is resistant to atheism, do not look at the arguments, do not look at her arguments, look at what effect it's going to have on her personal relationships, and I would go from there.
Well, thanks. I'll give that a shot. I would like the opportunity to have a convo with you some weekday morning.
Oh, yes. Listen, give me a shout anytime. The conflict is reduced in relationships, in my opinion. Conflict in experience. Conflict is reduced in relationships when you actually start talking about what the subject is, rather than avoiding the subject with a lot of fancy words. I'm not saying that's you, but you can feel, it doesn't mean that the relationship itself is solved necessarily, or the problems are solved. But there's a great easing of tension when you finally identify what the genuine motives are that the other person is experiencing in the conversation. I had a chat with somebody who was a determinist, and the conversations, of course, as they always are about determinism, was pointless, fruitless, and frustrating on the message board. But when we actually had a conversation, I got to ask him what it was really about, and we talked about his history and his childhood, and he had a pretty wretched experience. His parents would constantly lock him in the room and drug him and send him off to get drugged and stuff, so he didn't experience any free will. So when you actually get why people have what they call their philosophical beliefs, why they actually have them, and what effect changing those beliefs is going to have, then you're actually talking about the thing itself, the actual motivation, what is actually driving people to have the perspectives that they have. It is not rational. Almost never is it rational because we're not raised rationally. And so people have their particular perspectives, which comes out of their history, comes out of conflict avoidance or conflict provocation or something like that. But when you actually break through the intellectual defenses and you talk about the thing itself that is the cause of their intellectual defenses or their pseudo-philosophical perspectives, you clear all of that rubble away and you stare at usually what is the grave of some essential aspect of the self that hopefully can be resurrected. There's an enormous relief and an enormous relaxation in the relationship because you're no longer fencing to avoid essential truths. So the essential truth is not about God versus non-God or about the state versus non-state. The essential truth is, what is the nature of my relationships? And very few relationships that I've seen or experienced, for that matter, very few relationships can survive the scalding sunlight of truth. Relationships tend to be vampiric in two senses of the metaphor, and in that they're draining and they cannot be exposed to sunlight. And so, find a way to crack through. Forget about God. It's not about God. It's about her relationships. Talk about that. Say, okay, let's pretend that you were an atheist. What would happen to you tomorrow? And what would happen when so-and-so called? And what would happen if so-and-so called and said, bring a cake to church on Sunday? Or what would happen to so-and-so, if they noticed your absence from church? Or, and that's where the genuine issue is. And if you pretend that it's about abstract arguments for God, I think you will just end up completely frustrated. And, the other way, that getting to the actual truth of the matter, who knows if it's going to save your marriage or not. It's definitely the best shot, I would argue, that you've got. But if it ends up not saving your marriage, of course it would be great if it did, but if it ends up not, at least you will get closure because you will have a genuine understanding about her motives rather than these sort of pretend perspectives.
Yeah, I mean, I've used the worst case scenario thing, and her only answer was, well, I would just die and that would be the end of it. When I
No,
died,
it's not
that would be
about
the
dying,
end.
and that would be the end either. I can almost
Yeah.
guarantee you. Very few people make their decisions on the afterlife. Otherwise, the Pope would have a much less gold lame in his disco suit. So it is about immediate stress and tension in the relationships. Unfortunately, women are tuned to be conflict avoiders and conflict minimizers, which means that they cannot approach essential or deep topics in their lives. And that is, I think it's very tragic for women, fundamentally. Tragic for everyone, of course, but it's very tragic for women because it means that they live a much less deep and rich existence. And this is probably why a quarter of American women are on psychotropic or antidepressants or anti-anxiety medications last year. So, I would like for women to have more exposure to philosophy, but that means that they have to grit their teeth and say that the truth is more important than my relationships. Because if my relationships aren't based on truth, well, damn it, they're just not relationships at all.
Okay, well, I appreciate that. I'll just have to try to get past the snapping teeth.
Right. And I think that the key thing is to say, well, the intellectual debates they're not working. I think there's, I'd like to know if there's something else going on. I'm certainly curious what it would be like and what do you think would happen if you accepted this. I'm not saying you should or do whatever, but I really want to understand what the practical consequences would be. And, you might need to be persistent in that. And of course, she needs, I think, to be able to express herself in a non-judgmental environment. Like if you're being genuinely curious about someone else's experience, and certainly you have enough water under the bridge with this fine lady to justify that, to make that a respectful and productive approach. If you're genuinely curious, then you can't sort of say, well, it's it's bullshit that you'd choose God over your relationship with me, or I can't believe you would be that sensitive to other people's disapproval. It has to be a genuinely open and curious environment, and if you're patient enough with that, it seems almost certain that you will get to some very important truth.
Yeah, I'm trying to get through RTR2, and I'm trying to use those tools.
Good. Well, I hope that helps, and if there's anything I can do to help, please let me know.